Hi there, I'm Lou Sherman, Technical Consultant in Customer Success, and I'm a friend of Max. This video is a demonstration of how you can create your own custom policies for API Manager. We will verify that Maven has been set up. We will create the project structure by using Maven. We will step-by-step go through the implementation of the logic in the custom policy. We will package and deploy our custom policy into the Anypoint platform. And last but not least, we will also try out our custom policy. So let's get started. Let's quickly have a look into the use case that we are trying to solve today. This will be our sample API where we will build this custom policy and apply it later on. It's a very basic API with only one resource, and it only supports one method at the moment, which is the get method. It's a quiz API, and as you can see, it returns a question in the body, some options for the answer, and a hint. The goal will be to create a custom policy that can manipulate the response body based on the level the requester is providing us. So for example, if the client is a beginner, we want the response body to also include some options for the answer and a hint. If the client is not a beginner, because it is an expert, for example, we want the response body to only return the question without any options for the answer and without any hint. And that's basically our use case. Before we actually start, let's quickly verify that Maven has been set up correctly to work with Mule, as we will need Maven to set up our template Mule project, package, and deploy our custom policy into Exchange later. In order to check that, open your Finder or Explorer and go to your Maven local repository. This is normally a folder called .m2 and configured as a hidden folder. So if I want to review the .m2 folder on my Mac, I go into my home folder, then I press Command, Shift and Dot to unhide my hidden folders. And there we will see the .m2 local Maven repository. In here I have two things. First the repository itself, and then the settings.xml file. The settings.xml file contains elements used to define values which configure Maven execution in various ways, similar to the pom.xml, but with the difference that it's not bounded to any specific project or distributed to an audience. These include values such as the local repository location, alternate remote repository servers, and authentication information. So in this case, we can see an example of the setup of a settings.xml file, but without any real credentials in it. First, we have the section for servers, where we store usernames and passwords for our repositories. And the first four that you can see in here are publicly available, but will depend on the Anypoint user. The Mule repository is not publicly available and requires a Mule Enterprise license. If you have a Mule Enterprise license, you can request your own credentials from our support team. Then we have the section for our remote repositories, like the MuleSoft public repository, the MuleSoft release repository, the MuleSoft snapshot repository, and the MuleSoft master repository. And then we have a separate profile for the Mule Enterprise repository that we've already mentioned. And if you want to learn more on how to request your Mule Enterprise repository credentials and how to configure settings.xml to access it, check out the link below the video. One last step that we will do is check if Maven has been installed and the version of Maven. So let's open a terminal window and type mvn-v, and we see that Maven has been installed successfully. Okay, as a next step, we will start setting up the folder and project structure for our custom policy with the help of Maven. So let's go back into our terminal window and make sure we're in the correct workspace where we want to set up the project. Next, we need to copy the Maven command to create our archetype repository into our terminal window. You can find the link below the video to copy and paste the Maven command. Our Maven command has parameters like the archetype group ID, the type of the archetype version, our org ID, the policy name, the policy version, and the package type. Most of the parameter values are already set, except for the org ID and the policy name. For these two parameters we have defined two placeholders, which we'll set just in a second. So let's hit enter, and we see that Maven is asking us for the group ID. So we will paste that in, and next we need to provide the artifact ID, so we'll enter a value for that parameter as well. And then we need to provide a description of our policy, followed by the policy name. And finally, we need to confirm our inputs with yes before Maven actually starts the build process. So let's now move over to Anypoint Studio and see what our template project structure looks actually like. We go into File and Open Projects from File System. Select the directory for our newly created custom policy and click Open and then Finish. And there we see our custom policy template project in the Package Explorer. Maven has basically created 4 files for us. First, the quiz level custom policy.yaml file, which we will use to define the user interface for API Manager when we later apply our policy. Then, the template.xml file, which has one global element for the policy implementation logic. So we can go into the XML view to see what the template looks like, and we basically have an HTTP transform scope to set the HTTP response code to 201, then a body transformation to return hello world, and creating a new header with the value hello world. So that's what the template XML looks like. Of course, we also do have a pom.xml file where we have things like group ID, artifact ID, version, the description which we've set earlier already, properties, dependencies, and the plugins. And then we also have a Mule artifact.json file, which has the minimum Mule version in it at the moment. But for our example today, we don't need to add or change any values in here, so we can simply close it. So far we've created a template project by using Maven, so let's now start filling our custom policy with life. And we will start first with the quiz level custom policy.yaml file, where we basically describe and define what the user interface in API Manager should look like whenever someone is going to apply our custom policy to an API. One concept within custom policies are handlebars, or properties defined under configuration. Handlebars are used for resolving the configurable parameters of the policy and implementing semantic logic such as conditionals. This is the preferred method of using user inputs in the policies. For our example, we'll need 2 handlebars, which I'm going to copy in. So the first handlebar is called Quiz Difficulty Enabled, and it's a checkbox the user can tick to determine if the policy should change the difficulty based on the provided level or not. So it's of type Boolean, it's optional, and the default value is false. The second handlebar that we are going to define is called Quiz Difficulty Condition. And this one is going to be a text field where we can enter an expression or condition for our policy to check. If this expression is true, then our policy flow will be executed. So it's of type expression, as we are doing this in DataWeave. It's not sensitive, allow multiple uses false, and this handlebar depends on our first handlebar. This means that our expression field should only be available from the user interface if the quiz difficulty enable checkbox has been set before. Hence, depends on key is set to quiz difficulty enabled and depends on value is set to true. Okay, so far we've set up the quiz level custom policy.yaml to configure the user interface in API Manager. The next step will be to implement the custom logic. So let's head over to our template.xml file. We've seen that our template has some sample scopes in it, but the general scaffold of our policy starts with the HTTP policy proxy element with the name argument. The HTTP policy proxy element must contain HTTP policy source or a HTTP policy operation element. The HTTP policy source block contains the actual instructions to execute relative to the Mule flow the policy is configured to handle. It can inject instructions before an HTTP listener event fires at the start of a flow and inject instructions after the flow completes. Any Mule event operation that is defined before the execute next element will be executed before the start of a flow within an HTTP listener. The HTTP policy execute next element is required to continue the Mule event processing. It can trigger other policies or the application flow. First thing that we will change in the template.xml is to create a variable where we store the level of difficulty which we receive as a header. Next, we need an if clause to check our handlebar from the user interface, which we have created earlier in the YAML file. In our case, we want to store the data with quiz difficulty condition handlebar into a variable if the checkbox has been ticked. After that, we can move into the execute next section. In here, we first want to store our payload into a variable, which we can then later use and manipulate. So we are creating a new variable called content and storing the payload into the variable. The next step is the actual transformation. To change that, we can simply remove the hello world content and enter our condition. In this example, we have a data weave transformation which creates an output of type JSON. This transformation checks the variable enable quiz difficulty, which we are setting up here. And if it is true, we take our content variable, which has the payload stored in it, and remove the hint and the options JSON element to increase difficulty. In case the enable quiz difficulty variable is not true, we simply pass through our payload. Then we also want to add a custom header, and for that reason we are changing our template header to quiz policy and the value applied. And that's basically all the transformation we need to do in the template.xml file. So we finished our YAML file, we filled our template.xml with logic. The next step is to package and deploy our custom policy into Anypoint Exchange. For that reason, we need to go back into our terminal window. Make sure that you're in your specific project folder and not in the workspace. From there, we can perform a Maven clean package command, and we can see that it has been successful. So we can now perform a Maven clean deploy command, which will deploy our custom policy into our Anypoint Exchange. And there we go. We are ready to take our policy and apply it to our APIs. Before we apply our policy, let's quickly check out what it looks like in Anypoint Exchange. So here we have all the assets that have been deployed into our Anypoint Exchange. And one of these assets is, of course, our new custom policy. So if we go into the custom policy, we can actually see that the documentation is rather short so far. But what we can already see is the description that we've set earlier in the YAML file. And as a next step, we want to apply our new custom policy to our API. So let's head over to the menu and select API Manager. And in here we see that I'm currently managing two APIs. Of course, for our example, we want to select the quiz API. In here, we need to select policies, apply new policy, and then scroll down to our quiz level custom policy. We want to select the most current version, of course. And next, we can see the user interface that we've created earlier in our YAML file with the handlebars. So we have the checkbox for enable quiz difficulty, which will tell the policy to execute the logic that we've implemented earlier. So we click yes. And since we have defined the text field for the condition clause as a dependency of the checkbox, we can now enter our data weave expression here. We want to apply the custom policy to all API methods and resources, so we can leave that and we click apply. And there we see that our policy has been successfully applied to our API. Okay, we're almost done. And the last thing that we want to do is actually try out if our policy works and what it looks like in real life. So we will jump over into Postman and we have our GET request for our quiz API, which is running on CloudHub. We're not providing any headers so far, so let's see what happens if we perform the request. Okay, we're just seeing the question without any options or hints for the answer. So let's now create a header for the level and give it the value beginner. And there we go, our policy works. We can now see the additional options and the hint for the answer. We can also try and change the level header to expert, and this will remove again the options and the hint from our response. I hope you found this video helpful. Feel free to leave a comment, check out the links below the video, and don't forget to watch the other Friends of Max videos too. I hope to see you again soon.